Dragoborne: Rise to Supremacy is an English-only trading card game released August the 4th of 2017 by the Japanese trading card game company Bushiroad. Bushiroad, which also makes Card Fight Vanguard, Wise Schwartz, Future Card Buddy Fight, Luck and Logic, Rebirth for You, and many others, had released several of their Japanese original games in English, but Dragoborne was their first attempt at a game released originally and exclusively in the English language. The game arrived without a whole lot of fanfare, lasted just over a year, and finally shut down with its final booster release, Reckoning of Vashir, on October the 26th of 2018. I'll get into a little of my interpretation as to why the game failed later on in the video, but while it was alive, it managed to develop a small but dedicated fanbase. And my general impression of it is that even years after its demise, the game is still remembered fondly by those that actually played it. So, how do you play it? Starting up is easy enough. You set your 3 banner cards face down in front of you and set aside your matching 3-colored dice. Then you shuffle your 50-card main deck and draw 5 cards. Each player then gets 1 mulligan, where they can reshuffle any number of the cards from their hand back into their decks and then draw back up to 5. Finally, players play 2 cards from the top of their deck to each of their 3 forts, then they reveal their banners set behind those forts. In Dragoborne, forts are an important part of the playfield, and they impact a bunch of different aspects of gameplay. But to start, all you really need to know is that each player has 3 of them, and they each start with 1 banner behind them and 2 barriers on top of them. This forms the life system of the game, and the goal of the game is to destroy all of your opponent's forts, by destroying all the barriers at each of those 3 forts. Dragoborne progresses through several phases, most of which are going to be pretty comfortably familiar to anybody who has played a TCG in the past. You begin with your start phase, and you start with a stand step. This is where you take any of your resting cards, and you stand them. Next up, that's going to be a little bit less familiar, is the dice step. This is where you call upon the power of the dragons and materialize it by rolling all your dice. These dice will then become your dice pool for the turn. Next, you move into a draw step where you draw 1 card from your deck, and then you move into a resource step. This step is where you take the top card of your deck and you place it into your resource zone. However, the first turn player will skip this step. Next up, we head into the main phase, and again, there should be a lot of pretty comfortably familiar actions for players to be taking in here. You can play out cards from your hand by paying their mana costs indicated in the top left corner. There are 2 main card types, which are spells and creatures. Creatures are played to forts, and each fort can support up to 2 creatures at a time. So, here we'll go ahead and we'll play out Goblin Madcap. Players must match at least one of their resources to the color of the card they're playing. In this case, Goblin Madcap costs 1, so we need to spend 1 red mana to play it. To use up the rest of our mana, we're going to go ahead and set an ambush. Ambushes are a type of spell that are played in front of forts. Each fort can support 1 ambush, so we'll go ahead and tap 2 and play this out in front of this fort here. Ambushes have a variety of trigger conditions, but usually they will activate when the opponent tries to attack the fort and offer some kind of a defense. Since Dragoborne doesn't have instant speed effects, this is very important to be able to help give you a bit of action to use during the opponent's turn. In addition to playing cards, there's plenty of other things that players can do during the main phase. They can activate the abilities of their creatures, they can move their creatures from fort to fort, and perhaps most uniquely, they can allocate their dice. Dice in Dragoborne have 2 main functions. You can Drago Cross. This is when you put a die on a unit. That gives the unit +1/+1 as long as the die remains on it, and it can activate various Drago Cross abilities. Note that the number on the die doesn't matter here. As long as the die is on the creature, it's giving it +1/+1. It doesn't matter if the number is a 1 or a 6. The other function of dice in Dragoborne is to use them as Drago Shields. This is where you play them in front of a fort of a matching color, and it acts as a defender for that fort. Oftentimes, early in the game, shields are going to be much more valuable than Drago Cross, but as the number of your forts begins to decrease later on in the game and you start gaining access to some powerful Drago Cross abilities, you're going to need to make that call on a case-by-case basis. After the main phase, we can then move into the combat phase, but the first turn player skips their combat phase, so we'll just skip over that here and see how it works for the second turn player. Finally, at the end of the turn, you discard down to a hand size of 7, and then you remove all the damage from creatures in play. Additionally, at the end of the turn, you also resolve game loss. Players lose the game when all 6 of their barriers at each fort have been destroyed. However, you only check to see if the player has actually lost at the end of the turn. Functionally, this doesn't make a whole lot of difference to gameplay, but it is worth noting since it is quite different than most other games that resolve game loss as soon as the condition is met. Now it's the opponent's turn, and they're going to play through their turn in much the same way. They're going to roll their dice, draw a card, and play out a resource from the top of their deck. It's worth noting that since your resources are coming off the top of your deck, your resource development can be a bit random. That being said, you start the game with 1 banner of each color, so the impact of not drawing exactly the colors you need is going to be quite minimized here, and you are guaranteed 1 more resource each turn, taking a lot of the uncertainty out of your resource development. The opponent is now going to move into their main phase, and they're going to take some pretty similar actions to what we did. They're going to play out a creature from their hand, and they're going to set an ambush. Now, since they are going second here, they do have the option of attacking. However, there's not any particularly open spots to attack on this board here, so instead, they're going to use one of their creature's abilities. In this case, the ability has a cost of Siphon 2 blue, which means that you reduce the value of the blue die on your field by 2 in order to meet that cost. In this particular case, the ability lets them look at the top card of our deck and decide to either put that card back on top or send it to the bottom. In this case, it looks like they're not particularly worried about it, so they're just going to leave it on top. Next up, it comes back over to our turn, so we stand our resources, roll our dice, draw a card, and play out the top card of our deck to our resources. Now we'll play out 1 unit from our hand, play a second unit out from our hand, assign our dice, and then we'll move into combat. Now, this turn we actually do have some good attacks here, so we're gonna see a bit how combat works in this game. Creatures in Dragoborne attack 1 at a time, and their attacks target an opposing fort. In this particular case, we will tap to attack, and we'll target this fort over here. When attacking a fort, the first line of defense is always the Drago Shield. So in this particular case, we have an attacker with 3 power and a Drago Shield that is acting as a 0/3 defender. So the Drago Shield jumps in the way, takes 3 damage, and that is enough to defeat it and remove it from play. With the Drago Shield out of the way, we're now free to attack a little more directly. If the opponent has creatures at this fort, then they're able to use these creatures to block by tapping them. But since they don't have any creatures here, we're free to move in for a direct attack. When you land a hit on an opposing fort, the player controlling that fort checks the top card of their barriers. If it has Fort Burst, they're able to activate that Fort Burst effect right away. If it doesn't have Fort Burst, however, the card is just added to their hand. So this fort is still undefended, so that means that we get to attack again with our other unit to take out the last barrier at this fort. All barriers at this fort are now destroyed. Now, fortunately for us, that means that we don't need to worry about targeting it for any further attacks. That's 1 less target that we need to prioritize. However, for the opponent, this also means that they don't need to allocate their resources to defend it. It's especially worth noting here that the destroyed fort is still able to support creatures. Destroying a fort doesn't affect the field of play, it only reduces the life total and sort of changes how cards need to be allocated. So at this point, you've basically seen all of the major mechanics of Dragoborne, and you should more or less have all of the information needed to know how to play. So in this case, we'll just skip to a later turn to see how all of this comes together. At this point in the game, there's been some damage exchanged on both sides, and there's a lot more creatures in play. We'll begin our turn by untapping, rolling our dice, drawing a card, and playing out a resource. In this case, the resource is white, which is quite nice because our early resource development has been very heavily skewed towards black. Our opponent has gotten a little luckier and they have a more balanced resource development. Moving into our main phase, we will assign our dice as Drago Shields and put one over here as a cross on one of our units to give it a power boost. Since this fort is destroyed, we don't need to allocate Dragon Shields to defend it. We'll also go ahead and use a spell from our hand. This gives +2/+2 to one of our units, and since our white die is between 1 and 3, it has the effect of additionally giving another unit +2/+2, so we get to power up 2 of our attackers. Now, there is no room on our field for more creatures. We have 2 at each fort, and while we could replace a unit already in play with a stronger unit from our hand, we're reasonably happy with our current board state, so we're just going to move into combat. We will attack the Drago Shield and get a little bit ahead of ourselves by noting the damage before the opponent reveals their ambush. Fortunately, the ambush can destroy a creature, but the opponent is not interested in destroying our attacker. They're much more interested in destroying a potential defender that is a little bit stronger. So the attack goes through and hits the Drago Shield. We will then break the shield with a follow-up attack. A third attack is going to get blocked by the opponent's creature. Both creatures are going to deal damage equal to their power to each other, and any creature with equal or more damage than their endurance is then destroyed and removed from play. In this case, the attack leads to a mutual destruction and both creatures are destroyed and removed. Now with the opponent's defenses out of the way, we're clear to move in for a direct attack. The opponent hits a fort burst that fortunately allows them to play out the barrier creature as a last defender. This gives them the vital defender that they need to stop our final attack, so they survive the turn with 1 barrier remaining. Since we can't close out a win with our last attacker, we'll instead leave it back on defense and pass the turn over to the opponent. So, if that is how to play, how does it all come together? What works in the game system, and what potentially doesn't work? First off, the game very obviously borrows quite a lot from Duel Masters. From the life system, the resource system, and to a lesser extent, the combat system. While this is obviously a rock-solid foundation to start from, the game has several unique tweaks to give Dragoborne its own very unique flavor. First up, like Duel Masters, the game doesn't have dedicated resource cards, but rather uses any card from the deck as a resource, which reduces how punishing poor resource luck can be to players. This eliminates a potent source of player frustration, and is usually a good move. It also starts with 3 resources in play, which helps alleviate the 1-cost problem to some extent. It's also worth noting, banners don't lock you into colors. You can run cards from other colors, you just have a harder time playing them since you don't have guaranteed access to off-color resources, and resource development is somewhat random since it is played from the top of your deck. The resources coming from the top of your deck rather than from your hand also means that you run out of cards to play much less quickly than you do in Duel Masters, meaning players are going to have slightly more options to choose from over the course of gameplay. It's somewhat reminiscent of Hearthstone's system, but there's a bit more uncertainty here since while your resources do tick up every turn, you have relatively little control over what resource is going to be flipped off the top of your deck each turn. This blend of consistency and uncertainty is something I think comes together extremely well, and it was a really solid implementation of a Duel Masters inspired resource system. The combat system is another strong point that I think is worth mentioning. It's superficially similar to Duel Masters, with units attacking one at a time to damage opposing shields. Notably, however, Dragoborne lets all units block incoming attacks. This obviously feels great as the defending player since you get a lot more options to consider during the opponent's turn, instead of just sitting back and letting them hit you. Dragoborne also cleverly avoids Magic the Gathering's problem of board stalls with its fort system. Defenses at each fort are limited to 1 Dragon Shield die, 2 units, and 1 ambush, while the opponent can potentially direct all 6 of their units to attack that single fort. This makes stalls much more difficult and makes tempo in the game the main consideration in how offense and defense interact. It's a clever way of reintroducing universal blocking into a Duel Masters inspired system without falling into a board stall trap that Magic the Gathering system can inadvertently generate. Finally, it's worth talking about the elephant in the room, and that is this game's use of dice. While this can somewhat change the outcome of a game depending on how well you roll, it's not as intrusive as players used to dice mechanics in other trading card games might expect. Generally, their role is to stop the first opposing attack on a fort, or to give a unit +1/+1, which are both relevant effects, but they're relatively minor over the course of gameplay. While higher rolls can offer stronger defenses, and are also more useful for certain mechanics like Siphon, generally the amount of randomness it adds to the game is somewhat minimized. That being said, the perception of randomness to someone window shopping the game could be a potential negative, and there will be games where rolling a 6 rather than a 1 on your last fort's dragon shield will make the difference between winning and losing. It's not really any more random than the fort burst mechanic, or indeed even just drawing cards off the top of your deck, which all show up in plenty of other games with relatively little complaint, but the use of dice might rub some purists the wrong way. Overall, I would say that this is an extremely solid game system. So in that case, what caused the game to die off after barely a year of releases? Although the game system is solid, it does feel a bit similar to Duel Masters. However, it's different enough to carve out its own identity, and besides, there's not really any Duel Masters adjacent game to compete with in the North American market, so I don't think its similarity to Duel Masters is really a knock against it here. I have heard some concerns with power creep in the game, but that's practically an inevitable complaint for pretty much any TCG, and I don't think that in this case it can be considered a primary cause of the game's demise. Competition with the big three is also something that doesn't really explain why the game died off, since Magic the Gathering and Yu-Gi-Oh! Were both not in the middle of a particularly healthy meta. And indeed, by my own recollection, I seem to remember that this is about the time the Force of Will trading card game really started to take off here, mostly due to how weak the big three were performing in their meta balance. If anything, this was a good time to be a new trading card game, since players in Magic the Gathering and Yu-Gi-Oh! Were much more amenable to trying a new game than they usually would have been. It hardly seems fair that this game lasted only barely longer than Luck and Logic, despite offering a much more solid core gameplay experience. But Luck and Logic is where the real problem with Dragoborne comes in. Although the gameplay and overall game design are notably stronger than Luck and Logic was also released by Bushiroad, which is the same company releasing Dragoborne. And Dragoborne was announced right on the heels of Luck and Logic's cancellation. Seeing the cancellation of Luck and Logic felt like a vision of the future of Dragoborne, and ultimately by undermining player confidence in Bushiroad's long-term intentions of supporting this game, this ended up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Players were unwilling to buy into a game that they were convinced would be cancelled, leading Bushiroad to cancel the game due to low sales. There were several other knocks against Bushiroad here. They were already actively managing 3 other trading card games at this time: Weiss Schwarz, Vanguard, and Future Card Buddy Fight. Although this was not particularly out of place in Japan, for the North American player Dragoborne was aimed at, and given how narrow the North American trading card game market was and is, this seemed like a crazy number of different TCGs to be supporting simultaneously, and it seemed practically inevitable that 1 or 2 of them would drop off. The advertising support for Dragoborne was also somewhat lackluster. While Luck and Logic was given 2 full dedicated anime series, Dragoborne didn't really get any major media tie-ins. The game did get a few short net anime ads, but while definitely featuring more impressive animation than Magic the Gathering commercials at the time, they were still pretty limited, and they weren't going to give the game anywhere near the exposure a dedicated anime series would have. While games like Force of Will and Flesh and Blood have been able to break into the North American trading card game scene without any major media tie-ins, for a multimedia corporation like Bushiroad that has provided anime series for all of its major games, the fact that Dragoborne didn't get an anime series was not exactly a vote of confidence. Perhaps even more damning to the long-term success of Dragoborne is that Dragoborne was English only. It did not have the Japanese market to fall back on. A lot of smaller games, from Vanguard to Across, have been able to cling to life in the comparatively hostile North American trading card game market because the only real costs for those games are translation, printing, and distribution. Dragoborne, on the other hand, was left to cover all of that, as well as the more intimidating upfront costs of design, development, testing, and art budgeting. The conditions for Dragoborne to succeed, coupled with the relative lack of corporate support and Bushiroad's willingness to shut down underperforming games, meant that players were likely right to be skeptical of Dragoborne's longevity. And ultimately, despite generally favorable impressions of Dragoborne's gameplay, the game lasted barely longer than Luck and Logic had the year before, releasing its last set on October the 26th of 2018. If you have any memories of Dragoborne, either as a player or as someone who gave the game a pass when it was initially released, I would love to hear about it. I'm also interested in hearing your impressions of the gameplay overall. Leave your comments in the comments section below, and as always, take it easy and see you in the next video.